Today on Better Book Clubs, Goodreads versus the Storygraph and another platform you might not have even heard of yet. So I've been using both Goodreads and the Storygraph in tandem now for several years, and I have a pretty good sense of how the two of them compare. So I want to share that with you today and talk to you about 5 different criteria by which you can judge those two sites and decide which one of them might be right for you. I'm kind of assuming that everybody's familiar with Goodreads because it's been around for such a long time, since 2007, and I've been on it almost that long. It was purchased by Amazon in 2013, and so even though it's been around for a really long time, the site hasn't changed very much since then. I have a video that's several years old in which I talk about how to use Goodreads, and frankly, even though it's several years old, it's still relevant because the site hasn't been updated a lot. I'll talk to you more about that in a minute. So check out my video on how to use Goodreads if you're interested in learning more about that. The Storygraph is much younger. It came around in 2019. It was created by a woman named Nadia Odunayu. It is very similar in some ways to Goodreads, but also it has one kind of basic thing that distinguishes it from Goodreads, and that is, as you can tell from the title, it's graphs and charts and statistics that set it apart. So that's the first criteria by which I want to judge these two platforms. If you're interested in statistics and data, you're going to really prefer the Storygraph because what it's going to do is give you information about yourself as a reader. It's pretty interesting what you can learn. But honestly, bottom line, I'm not sure it really changes anything for me as a reader. Once the novelty of that kind of wore off for me, which was pretty quick, honestly, it didn't tell me anything I didn't really already know about myself as a reader. But I know that some people are really excited about data. You know, you can compare the types of books you're reading and the length of the books you're reading and the genre and so forth. Storygraph is definitely going to beat out Goodreads if that's what you're interested in. Storygraph also gives you more data points on individual books, and for that I find it more useful. I feel like I get more information, reader-generated information about each book on the Storygraph than I do about books on Goodreads. So in that sense, I would definitely give the Storygraph the upper hand. Another criteria by which to judge these two sites is the recommendations. I found that after it got going, the Storygraph gave me more interesting, unique kinds of recommendations about books than Goodreads did. I'm not sure why that is. It's possible that Goodreads is because it's now selling books, which the Storygraph doesn't do. It's possible that its algorithm is kind of funneling me more towards particular books that it wants to sell, whereas the Storygraph doesn't have that motivation, so it's maybe more willing to recommend quirkier books to me. But I definitely found that I started to get some more unusual recommendations from the Storygraph that were really interesting to me. I will say that it took a little while, so you can bring your shelves over from Goodreads to the Storygraph. The Storygraph will give you instructions on how to do that. But even though it had all my bookshelves of what I had already read, it did take a while to kind of catch on to what I was going to be interested in reading in the future. So the first couple books that I manually entered into the Storygraph, it really latched on to them, and it took it a while to kind of build out and break free of those first couple of books and start to give me meaningful recommendations. Once it did, though, again, I would give the advantage to the Storygraph over Goodreads when it comes to book recommendations. A third criteria that might not be that important to a lot of people, but that I want to mention, is just visual appeal of each site. So Goodreads, again, hasn't really been updated very much. It still looks like an older site. It's a little bit cluttered. It's perfectly functional, but it's not beautiful or pretty or appealing, whereas the Storygraph has a fresher look. There's just a little more breathing space on each page. It's appealing. It makes you want to spend more time there. Again, I've got to give the thumbs up to the Storygraph. Another thing to consider is the commercial aspect of each of these sites. So they're both free to use. The way Goodreads makes its money is by selling books, which it didn't used to do until it was acquired by Amazon. You can't purchase books on the StoryGraph, but you can on Goodreads. So that's how they generate income. On the StoryGraph, they're generating income through Plus memberships. And if you go to my video on the StoryGraph, I'll talk a little bit more about what is involved in those memberships. But it's a minimal fee per month to be a member, and that's how they're generating income. So for some people, the fact that Goodreads is connected to Amazon is problematic. As an author myself, I will say that I avoid Amazon whenever I can because I've seen how destructive it has been to the publishing industry. Honestly, when I'm shopping for anything, I try to buy it someplace else first, and then Amazon is my last resort. But I don't refuse to buy stuff on Amazon because sometimes that's the only place I can get something. So if you really don't want to support Amazon, that might be a reason for you to stay off Goodreads. So by this point, you may be wondering why I haven't just made the leap from Goodreads to the StoryGraph, left Goodreads behind, and stopped inputting my information about books onto both sites to try them both out and see what happens. And that's because of the fifth criteria, which is the social networking aspect of both of these sites. Because I've been on Goodreads for so long, I've developed some social relationships on that platform that I don't have on the StoryGraph. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't have them on the StoryGraph. You certainly could. You have friends on the StoryGraph just like you have on Goodreads. The StoryGraph is going to recommend people to you who are similar kinds of readers, which is a really great feature. So you can find out what those people are reading. That's an interesting way to have conversations and learn about books that you might not have heard about before. The StoryGraph allows you to set up what they call buddy reads, where you can bring together a group of friends on the platform and read together. But I am already kind of attached to a group on Goodreads. I've mentioned it before in my videos. It's called Classics and the Western Canon. I read with them maybe once or twice a year. I don't read everything that they read. I can't take that group with me onto the StoryGraph. Because that group is important to me, even though I don't read with them all the time, I would have to leave Goodreads behind in order to focus on the StoryGraph, and that means that that social aspect of the platform would no longer be available to me. So I suppose I could stop shelving my books and looking for book recommendations on Goodreads. I could stop doing the yearly challenges, and I could just dip in there when I wanted to join this particular group, and then use the StoryGraph for everything else. It feels a little bit unruly to be on both sites, but it might be an option for me in the future. So those are the 5 criteria that I hope will help you think some more about which of these platforms might be best for you. So if you want to learn more about how StoryGraph actually works, you can check out my video on how to use StoryGraph, in which I'll take you to my StoryGraph page and kind of walk you through all of the functions that that platform offers. But before we go, I want to talk about another site that's just in its toddler stages. It's been around for only 18 months, and it's called Shepherd. Shepherd was founded by an entrepreneur named Ben Fox, and what he was trying to replicate was that feeling of walking through an old bookstore, peeking around the shelves and not knowing what you were going to find next. He was finding that experience of discovering books online had become kind of vanilla. And so the way he puts it is that he wanted to reimagine book discovery online with more serendipity and delight. So Ben's approach to that is kind of interesting. He reached out first to authors who had a new book out, and he said, hey, why don't you tell us about your book, but then also pick 5 other books that are similar to it and talk about why those are the 5 best books in this category. For example, when you go on Shepherd, you might find a category called the 5 best books about China in the 21st century. So the author will tell you about their book, and then they'll tell you about some other books that are also on that topic. And you know that you're getting expert advice because these are the people who've done a lot of reading in their field, and they can really tell you what's out there and what they think is the best. So these lists include fiction and nonfiction. There are 25,000 plus book pages now on Shepherd. So right now what you can do is go on and either browse these book pages in a number of different ways, Or you could go on and say, hey, I'm really interested in this kind of fiction, or I'm interested in this kind of nonfiction, and type a search in the bar and it'll bring up some book recommendations for you. What you can't do is some of the things you can do on the other two sites, which are more member-oriented, like shelving your books. The member side of Shepherd is being built out, according to Ben, in 2023. It's really exciting to come in and take a look at something on the ground floor. So I've asked Ben to sit down for an interview with me on Zoom, and as soon as we're able to connect and I put that together, I'll be posting it for you. If you have questions for him about Shepherd, especially after you get on the site yourself to take a look, and the link is in the description below, then please leave me some comments about what you would like to ask about Shepherd. So as I put my interview questions for him together, I can keep yours in mind. So there's my comparison of Goodreads, the Story Graph, and the new site, Shepherd. I hope you'll take a look at all three of them and think about which platform is going to work best for you. If you like what you see here, please subscribe, click like, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.